Welcome to Sandwich Reviews. I'm the Talking Sentient Sandwich, and I love video games. Well, some video games. While I like experiencing a story through the lens of a playable character, sometimes that story can come across as less important, with some aspects being prioritized. But in rare cases, the story isn't sacrificed at all, creating an interactive narrative that is inherently more impactful than any other storytelling medium, albeit if done right. And studios are realizing that, putting time, money, and effort into new releases, and all that effort can genuinely be seen. But a small portion of the output of superhero-ish video games hasn't been for the better. A few of these games have pushed a multiplayer aspect that seems to be purely motivated by money. So unless you're going to somehow make these games work, which is not going to happen, stop with the multiplayer superhero games. It would be a lie to say I hate all multiplayer games, but more often than not, I just want to play alone. That might be a sad thought, but it's just because I'm really bad at games and using a controller in general, making the only emotion I feel when supporting a team anxiety, simply because I'm not helping enough, being a hindrance more than anything. And that's when I'm on a team. Forget competing against other people. The few times I've ended up playing games like Call of Duty or Halo multiplayer, I get killed before I even have a chance to see who's shooting me. And though I haven't messed around with the settings too much, first-person games can give me really bad nausea, so unless there's a really good one, I tend to avoid them. Despite all of that, I still love video games and have full faith that the medium will only grow in popularity and influence. In a speech she made when receiving the WGA Video Game Writing Award, Amy Hennig, most well known for being the visionary behind Uncharted, said,
"If you were to chart the progress of the game industry against the timeline of film history, we would just be entering the era of the talkies. We're just still wobbling on our training wheels, if you know what I mean."
There are plenty other examples that you can point to as being a turning point in video games, but for me and my love of cinematic gameplay, Uncharted takes the cake. Their stories aren't the best in drama, but they are designed that way, being in service of the story and cool action gameplay moments. While the first may not hold up by today's standards, the second and third Uncharted games are still amazing experiences to play, and I highly encourage you to do so. The way it effortlessly took control of the gameplay from you when it needed to without you even realizing it was masterful. You would be in a regular shootout, ducking from cover to cover, then suddenly the building would be shot down and a hasty and cinematic escape would be your only option. Or a tank would just fly in and obliterate everything in its path, and you would have to narrowly run away from it. A little off topic, but that's the reason the Uncharted movie didn't work. Casting, dialogue, characters, who cares about all that? They just needed more sequences of Nathan just narrowly jumping out of the way of something. Although Amy Hennig was let go of after 3 groundbreaking games and the property was handed to new owners, thankfully, Uncharted 4 was just as good as its predecessors. While not as action-packed, the last of the Uncharted games was a great send-off for the characters. It may have still had bombastic visual treats that made the franchise famous in the first place, but the writers set out to tell a more grounded story, which is why it never had the supernatural twist that all the previous games had. I know the third, strictly speaking, doesn't turn supernatural, but they hallucinate a bunch of weird stuff, so it counts. Yet, despite my enjoyment of Uncharted 4, I'm not sure if it works to put Nathan Drake in a real setting. His world was always meant to be hyper-realistic, and more than that, comical. Which is why the creators of that game went on to start a new franchise. They didn't know that at the time, of course. They just set out to create an engaging and grounded story in a medium filled with over-the-top animations and flair. But that game was called The Last of Us, and I'm assuming you've heard of that. Telling a beautifully tragic story set in the zombie apocalypse, kinda. The Last of Us will be remembered as an all-timer. Its mix of gameplay and narrative was not just seamless, but it was emotionally heartbreaking. Uncharted was still a game, and I love that, but this was a movie. Games coming before and after it have masterfully been able to tell an emotional experience, but none have been as torturously devastating. Telltale's The Walking Dead Season 1 might be in the running against it, but not many others can come close to making me cry like a little baby. Even God of War doesn't hit as hard for me. It is easily my favorite game of all time, and don't get me wrong, it is emotional, just not as cataclysmic to my heart. God of War and its sequel Ragnarok knocked it out of the park for me simply because of its one-take style. If you're not familiar with it, both of the reboots were designed to create an unending shot for 15 to 20-ish hours of game time. Of course, depending on how much time it takes and what side stories you go on, it can be even longer. Technically, the shot could be infinitely long. Within that, there are phenomenally choreographed boss fights and Uncharted-like sequences that seamlessly integrate gameplay with cinematic moments. And all the while, there is a great father-son story that takes just enough lessons and nods from The Last of Us so it's not too obvious that Atreus is just Ellie. But why am I bringing up all of these amazing games? It's so I can convince you to play them if you haven't. But it's also so I can unfairly compare them to the most recent absolutely terrible multiplayer games. If you're in that world, or if you're observant enough to have looked at the thumbnail, you know that the three I'm talking about are the Avengers, Gotham Knights, and Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. The Avengers I had the least hopes for, so it wasn't too much of a disappointment. Though I had played a game or two coming from Square Enix, I had no faith whatsoever that they could pull off a multiplayer game where you could choose to play as any number of the Avengers. Yet, they somehow delivered on that front, making the gameplay for each character unique. From Captain America's shield-throwing expertise and acrobatics to Hulk's rage-filled smashing, playing as these iconic heroes might have been the only aspect of the game that worked. The campaign of the game focused on the relatively new character Kamala Khan as she struggles to apply herself and her newfound powers. The game does a pretty good job with this, and also tells a story with the Avengers having broken up after a disastrous mishap that takes place at the beginning. Throughout, you bring the band back together, and I genuinely remember this being fun, though I'm confident a lot of those memories were clouded by the one really good mission where you're Tony Stark in his house. If you've played it, you know what I'm talking about. Unfortunately, the enemies are all the exact same robot, except sometimes they have a shield. There was lots of promise for new DLC with purchasable stories and new characters, which was delivered on, but I never felt the drive to open the game back up again. Once I finished the main campaign, that was it for me, which was clearly not what the developers had in mind. Gotham Knights, on the other hand, didn't have too much content to play after the main story was finished. I'm sure there were technically quite a few things to do, but not anything substantial. It may not come from the same developer as the Arkham series, but it was the same housing studio, so I still had hopes for it. And WB Montreal made Origins, so I figured they at least knew how to make a competent Batman game. But no, it was really bad. The one thing I remember, aside from completely wasting the Court of Owls storyline, is how empty and alone the open world feels. Maybe it was just because it took a really long time to unlock the traveling mechanics for each character, so it took that much longer to get from A to B, but the map really did feel unpopulated. I love the Bat family, so I was really looking forward to playing as one of the Bat children, but uncovering this massive conspiracy without the help of the Big Bat was an intriguing concept that was not utilized. Unlike the Avengers, there is little fun to be had in this game, and the one good thing they did do was pulled straight from the Court of Owls' New 52 run, that being the Labyrinth. Maybe just make another Batman Arkham game, because those are really good. Because of the effect the first two had on me, I elected not to spend the $70 that Suicide Squad costs. Sadly, that amount of money is a considerable investment for me, but I did watch a walkthrough, so I'm basically an expert. Nah, I'm kidding. The story that the title Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League implies isn't half bad, though it has its incredibly disappointing moments. The one thing that had me on the fence about buying it or not was the boss battles. The idea of a bunch of boss battles against the different members of the Justice League, each being more unique and difficult than the last, was so enticing to me, but they did not deliver on that front at all. From what I saw, it was just shooting them. Sometimes they were fast, and sometimes they were in the air. And speaking of just shooting people, that's all there is. Each character has a specific melee attack and moves around with a traversal mechanic unique to them, but the real damage is done with guns. I'll give King Shark props because he has a really big gun, but it's still point-and-shoot gameplay. Again, take all of this with a grain of salt. I clearly wouldn't, and didn't, but buy it and test it out for yourself if you want to. If you haven't noticed, all three of these games do have a narrative to them, but that story ranges from mildly interesting to flat-out disappointing. While effort was put into making the story fun, more effort was put into endgame content. The developers focused on continuous gameplay in an attempt to capitalize their profits. There is money in creating online multiplayer games that sustain their players with new content, but trust me, this ain't it. The one time a game has managed to break the multiplayer mold for me was in 2021 with It Takes Two. If you haven't heard of it, it is a two-player game that is only playable with another person. There is no option to play it alone. The game creates a multiplayer experience that repeatedly reinvents its platforming mechanics. But not just that, it still manages to prioritize its fun and emotional story. However, the same developer tried to strike gold with the same formula in A Way Out, and while it sold well, it wasn't the hit that was It Takes Two. Technically, there are also Nintendo games like Mario and Luigi's Mansion, but these, while fun to play, barely have a story. So keep on making single-player adventures. They may end up reiterating a lot of the same Uncharted-like iconography, but I'm fine with that. That's not a bad thing to me. The best modern example I can think of is Spider-Man. Despite flaws, these two games are masterfully made, but I'm honestly glad they're not making the Spider-Man multiplayer whatever that they were working on, because I just want to see more really good stories. The upcoming Wolverine and Wonder Woman games are definitively single-player stories, and that fact alone gets me more excited than any other. So please, stop with the multiplayer. It clearly hasn't worked for you, so stop trying. Just let me play a story. Thanks for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and enjoy a delicious sandwich.